us in the future, giving continuation to the study of this beautiful book that will be presented to us again in the form of a chapter. May God bless us all, our speaker today, and so be it. As a reminder to all of us, it's important for us to remind the steps that we take in life, right? The things that we start. It's extremely hard to start things, right? But it's extremely hard as well to give continuation to what we start, especially when it is continuous. It takes time, it takes dedication to connect in one chapter to the other, to study what's coming ahead of us, and not to forget as well that when we're speaking, we also learn from it, right? It comes right to our heart, and we're like, wow, right? And I'm saying this because we all have been involved with a long test like this, and I'm pretty sure Kirsten goes through the same thing, right? Learning and evolving as well with this message and giving continuation to this amazing book, Times of Health and Conscientiousness. And today, she will be speaking of chapter 5 of the second part of the book, the chapter is entitled Health and Conscientiousness. Kirsten, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here, and for those of you who are listening on the web. Oh, sure. As we were and preparing this talk now for several weeks, and thinking about this topic of health, it is a topic that millions and millions of people across the globe are so interested in. Seeing as though that we're in our physical bodies, and having good health is usually deeply connected to our quality of life for a lot of us. So to be healthy for some can equal happiness, even though the World Health Organization refers to health, and they've had this definition now since the 1970s or 80s or even slightly before. The World Health Organization defines health the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. And we're going to talk about healing and cure, the difference between the both, very high level. And if you have been with us as we're studying on Thursdays, the Genesis, we read just this past week. XIV is 14, chapter 14, item 32, something like that, 31 or 32. It's entitled Healing. And there, the good spirits, Kardec, gives us this understanding of healing. This healing that can come from a discarnate or an incarnate, or from someone's magnetism. And sometimes it's a mix of both. But at the end of the day, or I should say, for the purpose of today's lecture, we wanted to bring it not a focus that's more broad, but a focus where it's internal. And with that, we wanted to share this definition, which is pretty on par with some of what the World Health Organization has shared, other definitions, and to some degree, spiritism in a way. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But this quote comes from the author, Susan Hawach. A cure signified the banishment of physical illness, but a healing could mean not just a physical cure, but a repairing and strengthening of the mind and spirit to improve the quality of life where no physical cure was possible. Now, this is interesting. And if you were, I'm looking out here in the audience now, if you were with us this past Thursday, you would have heard this story told, and we're going to share it again. It's the story of Mary Magdalene. And what's really interesting is that Most people are familiar with Mary Magdalene. She was the famed prostitute in the Bible, and she met Jesus, turned her life around, and became a follower of Christ. And she was this humble follower of Jesus. But few know that at the end of her life, she devoted herself to helping those in the leprosy, we could say, colonies in a sense. Or because if you had developed this incurable, at that time, but curable now, this incurable disease of leprosy, which today is known as Hansen's disease, when you developed it back in the time of Jesus, it meant death. So you were excommunicated from your family, from any parts of normal society. They were lived out in the caves and had to live very rudimentary lives, very difficult. So Mary Magdalene dedicated the last umpteen years of her life caring for those with leprosy. And as one would expect, she developed leprosy. She died along those whom she helped. But very few people who even know this part of the story are often confused and think about, well, Mary Magdalene was healed by Jesus. She came to know Jesus. She walked with him. He healed her. She changed her life around. She left prostitution. But who's to say that she wasn't healed, but yet that perhaps she maintained some illness within her essence, in her spirit, that was being cleared out by her physical body? And even what's most interesting is that Mary Magdalene was known to have been very beautiful for a woman of her time. She had extreme beauty for that time. So to have died of a disease, if those of you aren't familiar with leprosy, because we really don't see it so often now, and if we do, it's very much in the early stages and is cured with antibiotics. But in those stages, in the olden days, before onset of antibiotics, it literally, the disease would eat at your skin. You literally would, not wanting to get too gruesome, but you really would decay slowly. So for someone who had so much beauty, to experience that was quite interesting. And some of us can even say maybe that was part of her final curing, her final expiation of her experience in that life. So for clarity and for our talk today, when we talk about healing versus curing, someone can be healed but not cured. And there are those who are cured in the physical body, but not healed in the spirit or your essence of who you are. Something for us to think about. Because oftentimes we may suffer and feel like, oh, I still have this illness. And we think, oh, well, because I'm not well. Well, sometimes, and not wanting to get too deep into the healing process and how the different spiritual bodies that we have, our paraspirit and our physical body and our essence or our spirit. But all illness and health comes from who we are, the essence of who we are. Let's say spirit, because it's easier. And when we have illness or health, it manifests in all of our bodies. And let's just say in our body. So we often confuse that and think, well, if I'm ill, I must have something really wrong with me. Not necessarily. Or we might look at people that are perfectly healthy in the physical sense. Oh, they must have nothing wrong with them in their soul. That doesn't mean that. So it's just something for us to keep in our minds as we go and we talk today. But also to frame our discussion today, it's interesting to know about the country that we live in, the United States of America. So one of the richest countries, there are other ones like Japan and other countries, one of the richest countries and most developed. But interestingly enough, we spend the most money in our healthcare system in comparison to other wealthy countries. And we're not putting down the US. We are simply sharing data. This comes from the analysis that was done in 2022 by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. You can look it up online. This is simply a fact. The US has the lowest life expectancy at birth, the highest death rates for avoidable or treatable conditions, the highest maternal and infant mortality rates, and among the highest suicide rates. Actually, we are ranked third. Japan is the highest, then there's another country which I'm forgetting, it's off my head, then there's the US, but we're the third highest. We're up there. And we are the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest. The US has the highest rate of people with multiple chronic conditions and obesity rate nearly twice the OECD average. Twice than what other high income or wealthy countries. And we spend trillions of dollars. Now, we share this not because we say, oh, it's a broken system. It's clearly something's not right. Is it the system? Is it the people? Is it the culture? Still yet, the jury's not out yet. And also, and this comes from SAMHSA, which is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, within the United States, broken down by gender, age, and race. And the one category that has the most diagnosis of mental illness are those who have deemed themselves on the survey as belonging to 2 or more races. Second is American Indian. And third is white. And yes, more females are diagnosed more often. These are just statistics, not meant for us to go crazy deep into it, but just to frame our talk today. Nowadays, we are aware, modern science, modern medicine is very much aware that there is a difference between having healing and a cure. Yet, we continue, despite our technological advancements, we continue to see mortality rates rise, illnesses kill us that shouldn't, meaning illnesses that we could very well, that are treatable. We see patients that are still dying regardless. So the question begs, is there something as we as individuals, because it's easy to look out at the populace or to blame, the government or whomever. And maybe there is blame to be put, but that's not what we're here today to talk about. We're here to do what Joanna always does and to share it, which is to look at our own self first. Because in Spiritism, what causes illness is me, myself, and I. It's not my doctor. It's not the pharmaceutical companies. It's me, myself, and I. And Joanna talks about a little bit in this chapter. She entitled Health and Conscientiousness. And again, just reiterating, because we don't want this talk to come off at all that we are bashing any one person, place, or thing. Not at all. Just to bring it back to this. To remind ourselves of this, what Joanna says. In order for individuals to acquire or preserve their health, becoming aware of themselves and their manner of being is essential. to acquire or preserve. So prophylaxis, what we call it, or being proactive in your own healthcare, to preserve it, or to obtain health. So whether you're sick or whether you're healthy, either way, we must, Joanna says, it's essential to be aware of ourselves and our manner of being. But what does that mean, to be aware? We talked about this. For those of you who are watching on the web, you can go back and watch the other videos in this series from the previous chapters. But this is a question we pose to you and want you to pose to yourself. It's a moment of reflection. Asking ourselves these questions. Describe yourself in 3 words. I want you to think about this right now. You don't have to answer, just in your head though. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What matters most to you? Name one of your recent achievements that you're most proud of, and what will make your life worthwhile. And we are going to highlight this 3rd question. What matters most to you? Does anyone want to share? What matters most to you? You don't have to share. But if anyone's feeling a little brave, Jeanette or Marty, that's all. Don't know? That's okay. Okay.
I like to be useful, be ready when something happens, someone needs me.
Like to be useful. That's what's most important, to be useful. Fascinating. Thank you for sharing, being brave. Antonia saying her life is most important to you. Yeah. Anyone else?
Peace of mind.
Peace of mind. I want us to go home and think more deeply about this. We're asking here and not giving much time for reflection, but go home and think about what matters most to you. And the reason why we're highlighting this is because, and Leo, you might remember this too, in the book Action and Reaction, it talks about something called a central desire. A central desire is what each one of us has. It's what drives us. It's what we want the most in the world. And that what tends to drive all of our behaviors, or a lot of our behaviors. Not saying that we have a mono idea necessarily, but underneath a lot of the things that we do is because of this idea. So for instance, I'm going to use Jeanette, if I may. I'm going to make this up because I don't know. Jeanette said her most important thing to her is to be useful. So that might look like, for Jeanette, she always likes to be involved in outreach to others. Whenever she's around people, she's always listening to see somebody needs something. And if you know Jeanette, she's like that. Like if she perceives you might need something, boop, there goes Jeanette. Now, without knowing her central desire and asking people, oh, what do you know about Jeanette? Oh, she's really nice. She's always helping people. So you see how her central desire can manifest. And again, I'm making some of that up because I'm not inside her head. But it's important for us. This bracelet off is making too much noise. It's important for us to know what that is. Why? Because in the book, Action and Reaction, Silas, the mentor, tells us that the lower order spirits, some may refer to them as obsessors, how do they gain access to us? Because they have to find a common point. They do a special observation, and they make a determination what your central desire is. Once they find that out, they use that to try to ruin you. Now, if your central desire is to want to help others, what would that look like? I don't know. But in the book of Action Reaction, they talk about the central desire of this young man who was super, super attached to money. He had inherited money from his father and uncle. Without giving away the whole entire story, he inherited a great deal of money. He was filthy rich. So his uncles, who his father had killed, were obsessing their nephew because they had been killed by his father and he had gotten all the money. Even though they weren't angry at the nephew, they were still obsessing him. But besides our point today. How they were able to reach him is because they realized his central desire was money. And so they began a whole process of a deep obsession. And if you can read about an action reaction, I highly recommend reading that book if you haven't. It's a great book where each chapter is a different case. How do we ask ourselves? How can we get to know ourselves? How do we do that? We talk about this a lot because it's important. How do you get to know yourself?
Pay attention to thought patterns.
Pay attention to patterns, habits, the habit of our thoughts, habit of behavior, habitual patterns we do without even thinking. Because Joanna reminds us we are creatures of habit. And she says, out of habit, we prefer and accept negative and altered behavioral states for the pleasure they bring, thus opening the way for illnesses. And you might be thinking, Kirsten, who takes pleasure in a negative, altered, who takes pleasure in that? So we began thinking, whenever we get mad at someone, at our loved one, let's say our daughter, and she does something to make us upset. We're in mid-conversation. She says something or does something, makes us upset, and then we shut down. And we were thinking about this behavior. There's pleasure derived from that. There is. It's the pleasure in our usual habitual behavior. It's when people say, I've become complacent, I'm comfortable with who I am, so you stick with what you know. Oh, I've always been like this. She goes on, consequently, they indulge in anger, jealousy, complaining, and anxiety, and they lapse into depression, which is a gateway to various infirmities, always justifying perturbing thoughts and harmful actions. They refuse to renew their mental landscape with its consequent changes in attitude, thereby predisposing themselves even more imbalance. Think about it. When a loved one has come to you and says to you, oh, I'll be the person, I'll talk about my personal experience, just to reiterate that, I'm not perfect, and anyone that stands up here at this podium is not perfect. We are all together still learning. So there was a time where my daughter came to me and said, oh, well, you always cut me off when we're having an argument, and you just cut me off and you don't want to talk anymore. And I'm like, yeah, I do. I don't deny it. Yeah. And then when I say that, it's always followed up, but these are the reasons why. I always justify them. We all do. Well, because this Y, this X, Y, Z, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Instead of saying, you know what? You're right. I am like that. I should really try to fix that. It's been a good 10 years where I found myself, and I thought I had really evolved in the mere fact of just admitting that I had the problem. I thought, wow, I'm advanced. Lo and behold, Joanna's like, no. It's good. you're on that self-awareness path. But this is all of us. We all have things like this about us. And when someone we love or care about comes to us and points something out that they find that we're doing that's hurting them, we'll say, oh, well, this is the reason why I'm doing it. Now, sidebar. This isn't about them. It's never about them. It's always about us. Looking at our habitual patterns of behavior, our thoughts. Because even myself, I found myself in this paragraph. And I reflected how easy and normal and integrated into all of our lives this is. Because we can, of course, I did some self-reflection. Then I began thinking about other people in my life, which of course we all do that. Not recommended, but of course we could think, for sure other people do this. Joanna's saying it for us to think about. But here, oops, did I? Okay, no, I didn't. Sorry. Here is really the meat and potatoes of this lecture. So if you're going to take a picture of something, it's going to be the next couple of slides. This is where your attention should be drawn. Because if you read her warning signs, and remember, they're not all inclusive, but if you read her warning signs, it should set up a red flag in your mind for yourself. She says, the warning signs regarding such a situation arise when one wants to apologize for a wrongful action, but cannot do so. Has anyone ever experienced that? You don't have to raise your hand. You can raise your hand in your mind going, yeah, that's me. Have you ever in your life wanted to apologize for something, but you just couldn't bring yourself to do it? Red flag. Recommence a task that was interrupted by anger, but feel reluctant. Embrace an unfriendly person, but finds it impossible. Discuss an unpleasant subject, but it is taken by an awkward silence. Start a conversation, but feels incapable or uninterested. She goes on. Or when you stay awake, presumably at night, unable to break free of an upsetting idea. Red flag. Continues to be anxious even when there's no reason for it. Feels unable to say something kind to a loved one. Feels unable to say something kind to a loved one. I'm sure I'm the only one that's experienced this, right? No one else has ever. No, just me. Trembles or feels extremely uncomfortable in the presence of someone perceived as being superior. Whew, I really found myself a lot in this, guys. I'm not even going to lie. I sat with this for some time and I felt depressed. And I was like, I shouldn't be giving the lecture. You remember when we used to work for this billion-dollar company, private company, and whenever we had to deal with whenever I had to deal with the CEO, he's a millionaire, and he lets you know it, like his manner of being and just his whole bravado, And I was terrified. Me and him, a lot of the employees there were terrified of him, absolutely terrified. Would tremble when I'd have to go to present, I'd lose my ability to think and speak until one day my boss said to me, Kirsten, he is just another child of God. He's not Jesus. He's not God. Why are you so nervous? He's as human as you and me. He makes the same mistakes as you and me. So what? He has money. So what? So what? That transformed my mind. So every time I would have to go and meet with him, I would always say to myself, he's a child of God. Like me, he's a child of God. We're all children of God. That really helped to change my perspective. But it's a red flag. Considers oneself unimportant within one's social environment. These and other symptoms characterize states that predispose one to disease. These and other symptoms characterize states that predispose one to disease. If that isn't alarming, I don't know what else will be for you or for us. Accepting these circumstances points to a preference for unhappiness. Who prefers to be unhappy? By cultivating these states, the conscience is blocked and becomes deadened. It returns to a lower level, to the sensations that still predominate in the evolutionary process. So we can see people, not always, but certain groups, certain social groups that are known to be deeply immoral, we tend to see them behave in a way that is very savage. For this reason, and it's not just for those extreme circumstances. This applies to everyone. If we accept these states of being, if we just accept the fact that I'm so worried about something and I'm really anxious and I can't free myself of that idea that I stay awake, it's predisposing us to disease. And what Joanna's saying here, accepting these circumstances, points us to a preference for unhappiness. She's saying if you continue in this, it's because you want to be unhappy. I'm not saying that. Don't shoot the messenger. If we are, Joanna says, perpetuatingly, continually in that state, it's because we want to be unhappy. We prefer that state. She goes on to say, since people are free to choose to be healthy or sickly, it is up to them to act with real freedom and make the decision to be happy. And it could be something as simple as, I'm tired of suffering. God, I want to be happy. Help me. It's having a simple shift in our desire to want to be different, where we can begin to change. Even if we're unsure where to begin, how to begin. Because you might think it's overwhelming to think of all the things that I need to work on or that I potentially need to work on. But simply praying a simple prayer and asking for that guidance. And Joanna shares with us how to go about unburdening ourselves. She says, start by undoing old negative mental patterns which have conditioned you to accept unhealthy behaviors. Start by undoing old negative mental patterns. And by golly, when I tell you it's going to be hard, it's going to be really hard. If I say to Samya, who loves yoga, Samya, stop doing yoga. So she gets up in the morning. Normally, let's just pretend I know Samya's life, I don't. But she gets up in the morning, she does her mantras, her yoga, like been doing it for years, right? And then I say to her, oh, Sama, you have to stop. So, the next day she's like, okay, I'm going to stop. So she gets up in the morning, and of course she's inclined to go do her yoga. And she's like, oh, but I have to go do it because I like it. Well, let's pretend for a second that the yoga is bad for her. It's not. Yoga is really good. But you're so used to it. Thank you, Samia, for letting me use you as an example. But we're so attached to our own behaviors. It's like our own crutch, our emotional crutch. We're used to it. To change is scary. To face ourselves is scary, and it's hard. There's no two ways about it. There's no two ways. She goes on. By practicing new ways of thinking based on order, the general good, and the development of your own potential, you will create automatic reflexes that will produce harmony and health. So now I'm going to regain some points with Samia. So let's say Samia led a very whatever kind of life, and then she began to integrate. Well, actually, this is actually true. She had one life before, pre-yoga and after yoga. So pre-yoga, I don't know, I didn't know Samia, but pre-yoga, there's some things going on. But once she embraced yoga, her life began to change. The way she thought about things, being disciplined, thinking about the general good, developing her own potential, created these automatic reflexes that now she's used to having healthy behaviors. And we've met a few recovering addicts. I've talked to hundreds, maybe thousands, in my career as a nurse. I've only ever met a few successful, rehabilitated, former drug abusers. And if you were to know them before and after, because generally those were my patients that I had been caring for close to a decade, if you knew them before versus after, totally different person. Mindset is more positive. They have more purpose in their life. They change their way of thinking. They change the way that they eat and their relationship with God. Joanna also adds, you must assume control over yourself, which is to say, become self-aware. That higher level at which emotion directs sensation. We are in this perpetual state. Endless messages are being directed from the mind to the body, producing habits that take root, replacing those that are responsible for disharmony and disease. This is constantly happening. Our brain, with its extraordinary files, is always storing data and has the ability to store 10 new facts per second. 10. It may seem hard to leave a bad situation for a better one, and it really is. Joanna does not sugarcoat. It's hard to change. It really is. But it's not impossible. Even so, all learning requires the repetition of the experience until it becomes set. Repetition, practice makes perfect. To continuously. And we will share that when we read this for the first time a couple months ago and realized that we had to make a modification in several of our behaviors, I can tell you as if it were today, how difficult that was to do because it was so ingrained in our brain. Probably since childhood, or even past lives. But repeating the behavior again and again and again and again and again makes a change. She says, similarly, the acquisition of values and standards of happiness goes beyond simply wanting. It's necessary to walk the path of achievement. Oops. Didn't mean to click that so soon. So it's important for us not just to talk the talk, but to walk the walk. It's nice to dream of a better society. It's nice to dream of what it would like if I were a better person. We need to make the decision to be happy, Joanna says. And inevitably, change, there's always a consequence of change. That it's twofold. One, we get better. Two, it's going to hurt. It's going to be hard. And some people call that suffering. And we found this interesting quote by Martin Luther King, and he says, "As my sufferings mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways in which I could respond to my situation. One, either react with bitterness or seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I decided to follow the latter course." And indeed he did, transforming his suffering into a creative force that changed the masses and that affected many people. We share this because we do have a choice when we encounter suffering in our lives. We can become bitter, sad, upset, which essentially looks like not surrendering. In the gospel, they have a chapter or subchapter that's entitled Obedience and Resignation. And ultimately what that is surrendering. It's accepting what is in our life, accepting who we are, but knowing that I can still do better. But surrendering is key. So, Samia, if you permit me, I do know a little bit about your story about yoga. Okay, I'm allowed to say a little bit. I really don't know a lot, but so our dear friend Samia, much like a lot of people that are here today, is it immigrated or immigrated from Brazil, was here and found herself once upon a time kind of sad, as many immigrants, right? You miss your home country, you miss your family, you miss your friends, you miss your other life. And she found herself, and I'm probably exaggerating and adding some fluff to the story, but she found herself in a situation where she wasn't very happy. Yeah. And Vlad's like, yeah. So amongst, I'm sure, other things in her life that she found, I like to think Spiritism too, but she found yoga. And instead of sitting in her unhappiness and her bitterness, which a lot of immigrants from a lot of different countries can find themselves in that situation when they immigrate here, understandably, because we miss home. And sometimes you're unable to go back for a variety of reasons. But we get lost in our own bitterness, in our own anger. But here we have an example of a young woman who said, I don't want to live like that. I want something different. So how she stumbled upon yoga, no idea, but she did. Transform her life. This can be all of our stories. And I'm not saying that we all need to go and be yogis, but we can, if we make that decision, like Samia did and said, I want to be happy. I want to be different. I want something different. I know I don't know what it is, but I want something different. In question 912 of the Spirit's book, Kardec asks, what is the most effective means of fighting the predominance of the corporeal nature? Layman's terms. How do I fight my own nature. As we live in this physical body, we end up having tendencies of a corporeal nature, right? That predominate, especially depending upon our evolutionary, from a spiritual perspective, from our evolutionary level. How do I fight that? Or how do I leverage it for my own betterment? And the Spirit Mentor's answer, practicing self-denial. Not self with a big S, self with a little s. Practicing self-denial, not thinking about ourselves in that egotistical way. So you know in the Bible when it says, if your eye is the cause of your sinning, cut your eye out. Spirit does not recommend you cutting your eye out. But self-denial. If you know that you struggle with eating too many donuts, don't drive by Krispy Kreme. Take it out of your purview. Is that going to solve the problem altogether? No. But denying yourself that thing that you know is not good for you and is adding to your issues, practice self-denial. With this effort, you will enjoy conscientiousness, health, and peace. Joanna ends her chapter in this regard. Practicing self-denial, being self-aware, making the choice to be happy, and saying it, confirming it, as some might say, manifest it. Say it out loud to yourself and mean it, if you do mean it. If not, then you don't, and you can remain in whatever it is that you are currently in. But if you truly want to have a change in your life for the better, pronounce it. Words have power. Words have immense power in our lives. When we go back to the very first thing Joanna says in this chapter. In order for individuals to acquire or preserve health, become self-aware, become aware of themselves, self-aware, and our manner of being. Simple, right? Simple yet incredibly difficult. If you ask a surgeon who's performed, for example, knee replacement, and he's replaced it 1 million times. And I had this experience when I was talking to an orthopedist right before he was about to retire. His office threw him a party. I had the opportunity to meet with him. I had taken care of a lot of his patients, hundreds of patients over a decade. And one of the questions I had always wanted to ask him, and I got to ask him before he retired, is how difficult is it really to perform orthopedic surgery? And he said, well, you're asking me now, as I have 35 years of this practice, I could probably do with my eyes closed. I've done so many. I was like, wow, really? He's like, absolutely. He said, I do them in my sleep. I think about it often because this is something you're, habitually thinking about. This has been my life. He said, now, if you were to have asked me this 35, 40 years ago when I first graduated medical school and I was getting into my residency in orthopedics, and after performing my first surgery, I would have told you it's extremely difficult, extremely difficult. But this is an analogy of us, of how when we change behaviors, it eventually becomes so second nature that you get to say things like, yeah, I could change a hip. I could change your hip with a blindfold on and no lights. I could do it and you'd be fine. We hope, let's aspire to reach that level of change in our lives. We just have to continuously make that change. So thank you so much for listening. I actually have one last thing to say. I meant to start out with this, but perhaps I was led to read it at the end. There's this Christian song, because we were thinking today about, health is an area where everybody wants health. And there's so many sick people in the world, physically or otherwise. There's so much, and there's so much suffering. I watched this body cam footage of a police officer that was called to the car of a veteran of the U.S. military. And the body cam footage, you hear the officer approach the car and he says, "Hi, sir, are you okay?" And all you hear is this sobbing cry of this young man saying, I'm on the phone with the suicide hotline at because of course they are sent the cup. And he said, I'm on the phone. He's like, I just want to unalive myself. I don't want to live anymore. And you hear his the sobbing, because the officer is super close to the guy, but you don't see his face. And we were thinking about that, listening to it a couple times, thinking, my God, there is so much suffering in this world. There is so much that people have so much pain. And I was thinking, what is comforting? And to us, who didn't grow up in the church, we grew up in Spiritism. So for us, Jesus is not necessarily on the cross, but for us, Jesus is this all-encompassing being. And there's a Christian song, and one of the lines of this song always gets me. Every time I hear it, it always brings a tear to my eye. And it reads, "You didn't want heaven without us. So Jesus, you brought heaven down. You didn't want heaven without us. So Jesus, you brought heaven down." And if we know a little bit about Spiritism and the lengths in which Jesus had to go through to come to incarnate on this planet was unbelievable. I complain about 24-hour flight to Brazil. Like, it's painstakingly, terrible. But then I always think, well, Jesus did so much. I think I could bear this a little bit. But think about that. There is this being that loves me so much and has done so much and continues to do so much and simply waits for us to join him. Just something for us to think about, to take home. So now I am ending. Thank you all again for listening. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. If not, we'll go to our second half of our meeting, which is our passes. Did you want to add anything, Samia, I spoke your testimony? Yeah.
You are 100% right. Yoga changed my life for sure, and I was in a stage that's feeling helpless, sad, homesick, and then I went to look for yoga just because I needed to get to know more people, practice my English, and then it changed my life for the better. And I'm still practicing, I'm teaching, and I'm happy about it. Yes, yeah, I work with yoga, and I want to compliment saying something like that. Now I have been working with chronic pain patients. I just changed departments in my job, and everything you said about how we need to take charge of our health is so important. I see people, and I'm telling about young people with chronic pain, not be able to pay the bills, not be able to find a job, with depression, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, because of the chronic pain. And I have been doing lots of breathing exercises with them, yoga practice, Reiki, and this is being amazing for them. So I'm so happy that what changed my life in the past, now I'm using to change others' lives. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. If no one else has any other questions or comments, we can go ahead and move to our passes moment. I know this is a lot to take in, and a lot of this from Joanna is just about taking it in, reflecting about it, digesting it, ruminating in it. All right, dear friends, let us transition to, leave it on? Okay. All right, Leo, I'll welcome you to the stage.